Inspired by a couple of perceptive comments on recent videos, I wanted to look at Switch 2's sales potential this year and then in the very long term. This isn't really a deep analysis video or a forecasting video, just a bit of musing. First of all, it seems probable that after a rocket start to Switch 2, the sales of the console will start to level off. This is normal after any launch and after any holiday season, and there's no reason to think Switch 2 will be any different, irrespective of the strength or otherwise of the lineup of games currently on the slate. However, Nintendo does seem to have strategized around this with not one but two films in the next 15 months. L. Daniel Jetfire made the point that I might be putting too much emphasis on the films, though, and the effect of the films a second time might be less significant than the effect of the first movie on the Switch sales. And it's an interesting point to explore. If we look at the Sonic movie franchise, the game grosses have increased, but this is slightly muddied by the fact that the first film released in the very early days of the pandemic, and Sonic 2 at the very tail end of some restrictions still being in place. A more common trajectory for sequels is progressively downward, and largely for obvious reasons. People might give a try to something the first time, but if they're not interested, they're unlikely to return. However, if people who didn't check out the films in the cinema the first time discover the films in between, it might well inflate the box office for the sequel. Even if there's a far bigger launch for the Galaxy film than its predecessor, this might not translate to people buying new hardware, though, if many of those people are already interested in Nintendo games and investigated Nintendo content the first time around. There are also reasons to think that the knock-on effect for Nintendo will be less this time around as well. Sure, in 2023's April to June quarter, they shifted 3.91 million consoles and 52.21 million units of games, but this was heavily skewed by the arrival of the massively awaited Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, which rocketed to 20 million copies sold in barely any time at all. Now, it's true that the quarter's games besides Zelda were otherwise relatively slight. I mean, I adored Advance Wars 1 Plus 2 Reboot Camp, and the adjoining quarter had absolute gems like Fire Emblem Engaged, Metroid Prime Remastered, and Pikmin 4, but it's clear that Nintendo were primarily focused on Zelda that quarter. Even so, 4 or 5 different titles, averaging a couple of million, is still significantly less than one major title with 20 or so million. So without the Zelda effect this time out, things could be quite different. Tears of the Kingdom was also likely a driver of console sales with its own dedicated OLED model. Now, there's a chance that Nintendo may try to do the same kind of thing over again. Maybe not a May game like Tears of the Kingdom, but if Pokemon and Grand Theft Auto are dominating the end of the year, I wonder if Nintendo could reveal and release a serious, heavy-hitting title for July. Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave and Splatoon Raiders are both from franchises which have done very well for them in this slot in the past, and it strikes me that these are the most likely options. But if Nintendo did have an absolute megaton Mario title, could they target it for late summer? A Mario Day reveal would give such a game roughly the same lead-up, 4.5 months, as Mario Kart World had, but they have so much stuff to sell in this window between the Super Mario Bros. Wonder re-release, Super Mario Galaxy 1 Plus 2, Mario Tennis Fever, let alone any number of past games and amiibo, that I don't know I see them wanting to torpedo the sales bonanza by letting people know that if they wait a bit, there'll be a much bigger and better game in the warp pipeline. If they wait until after the film, let's say May, which is when in 2018 the Pokemon Company revealed that the holiday season would feature Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, well, that's fine for holiday release, but would Nintendo really want a 10-week hype cycle run-up to such a major event game? Well, they managed 15 weeks with Bonanza, a smaller title sure, but still one that had a lot of significance for the company. A long run-up certainly has utility in terms of promotion, but ultimately the best thing for promotion is choosing the most eye-catching spot to launch, and if they choose the weeks after a major Mario movie, when Mario is still fresh in people's minds, and have a limited hype cycle, which means that they get maximum social media attention over a short period, it's quite possible it could get a significant amount of attention. It also has a fringe benefit that this would probably stabilize Nintendo's stock price in the face of concerns about the lack of games, assuming that people get used to the idea that the company might just drop a megaton title out of the blue with little notice, and so when Nintendo are quiet, it doesn't necessarily mean they don't have anything up their sleeves. At any rate, this, it seems to me, is their best way to leverage the movie to support Switch 2. The rest of their efforts may or may not factor into console sales extensively, but they will get a benefit to the games, and I could certainly see the way they're structuring their releases at present, incentivizing people to see Switch 2 as a logical purchase for families around the film. Additions like Rosalina in Super Mario Bros. Wonder and the child-friendly play modes using the Luma. But the fact is that a lot of the ways that Nintendo will benefit from the film are to do with their peripherals and non-console offerings. Toys, merchandise, amiibo, and more that probably have far higher margins than their games consoles. Assume then that the Switch 2 sales do indeed start to taper off as we enter the middle of the year, or at least any fillip from the movie doesn't fully balance out the tapering off from the early adopters. If they do in fact have big games up their sleeves, the problem solves itself, but if they don't, it becomes something they really need to deal with. In this case, I would expect them all the more to double down on their existing library, and while Mario Kart World is a Switch 2 exclusive, most of the back catalogue they can leverage is obviously on the original Switch. At the very least, carpet bombing the schedule with Nintendo Switch 2 editions would help to keep a sense of a very full schedule, even if the number of new games is on the low side. Still, if the Switch 2 second year is on the weak side, does this mean that the console's future is in doubt? I really don't think so, and actually, I don't even think it will necessarily stop Switch 2 reaching a very high total number of sales indeed, potentially, under certain circumstances, even topping the original Switch. This is a topic I addressed in depth close to the Switch 2's launch, and I'll link that much fuller breakdown at the end, but it's not hard to imagine circumstances where Switch 2 does very well indeed. Switch still has a high attach rate, and it seems plausible that Switch owners will, to a large degree, eventually upgrade, especially when the original console is supported far less and as major games come onto the market. Added to this, the much slower rate of console releases and the fact that Switch 2, while pricey in the current market, will be far cheaper than next generation consoles when they start to arrive, and I think Nintendo is in a decent position. I also think a mid-gen refresh model that is effectively a Pro machine is actually a very plausible option that was possibly only ruled out in 2021 due to the difficulty of sourcing chips during the pandemic. Assuming things are different this time, Nintendo may consider that a power bump in the early 2030s could keep third parties sweet for a bit longer and extend their generation another couple of years, assuming that a substantial mid-gen power boost would be more of an incentive for upgrading customers than the OLED was. If, as I suspect, we have some very long waits for a few major new franchises, it would also give these games longer to sell in before the technology is ultimately superseded. What I can't see Nintendo doing yet is a massive pivot to a Blue Ocean variant, or at least not just yet. They want Switch 2 to be the heart of their hardware console strategy, a device around which they can construct their multimedia and merchandising empire. It's not without precedent, of course, and I have mentioned before examples of the Virtual Boy, the DS, and indeed the original Switch launching while another successful machine is still doing fairly well, albeit in its later years. The dizzy heights of the Switch during some parts of the early 2020s especially kind of disguises the fact that this really isn't the norm for Nintendo over the years, and it's perfectly possible for Nintendo to do very well indeed of selling around 15 million consoles a year if they have a deep bench of other financial streams built up. This does seem to be where they're going with it, but I still think in the long term the Switch 2 might end up surprising us all. For more on this, do check out the video on screen. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to the Patreon supporters, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.